We are going to kick it off with Michelle talking for a little bit about what we mean when we call something a grand challenge or a moonshot.
So the grand challenge and moonshot terms, they're used a lot right now, and often for work that has an intended public benefit. And we're all champions of that type of work. But what we're talking about today, when we say grand challenge or moonshot, I didn't practice with the clicker, it works, is that it's an institutional commitment to make a significant impact in a particular area of priority where the goal is specific, measurable, aspirational, relevant, and time-bound. So that sounds good, but let's go through some examples so you know what we're really talking about. So the first example is the namesake, where the moonshot came from, and that's President Kennedy's moonshot, where he made a commitment that we would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth within a decade. It's very specific. It's, all those characteristics, this specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound. More recent examples are from UCLA. We have two. One focused on cutting the burden of depression in half globally by 2050. And we have a second that's focused on transitioning Los Angeles to 100% renewable energy and 100% locally sourced water, also by 2050, coincidentally. Indiana University is in the process of identifying its fourth grand challenge, and I'm going to focus on their third one, which aims to reduce deaths and ease the burden of drug addictions. University of New Mexico just announced 3 in the last month. UT Austin is developing its third, but let's focus on the 2 that are live. One is ensuring that Texas is a thriving place to live in 2050, even with rapid urbanization and increasing climate extremes. And number 2, helping Central Texas families struggling with adversity to thrive by overhauling the way scientists learn from and about these communities. So as you can see, with the way these have been framed, we know what the target is, and therefore we know when and if we achieve it. And this is really different from how universities typically conduct research, which is much more exploration usually. But because we're making commitments, we're taking risks. So now that we've kind of given you a sense of what we're talking about with grand challenges, let's go through what a few of the active programs have in terms of their attributes that make them successful. So the first attribute we want to focus on is that the grand challenge really needs to be a Goldilocks fit for the organization. That means something we're positioned to do, it plays to our strengths, it's ambitious but not impossible, and for which we have funding or the confidence to get the funding. At UCLA, we were playing to our strengths when we picked neuroscience and sustainability. The next one is leadership commitment. This can't be overemphasized as important. And that has to be done not just through what people are saying, but also in their actions. It's got to be in the strategic plan if you have one. It should be in the conversations that the leaders are having internally and externally. The third attribute of a successful moonshot is that we need to have the right partners. We can't do these alone. These are really ambitious endeavors. And so if we're trying to impact a community, we should be working with that community. The fourth thing is that we should have unique and meaningful ways to engage students. And that's with experiences and outlets that are beyond the classroom. While it's tempting to start right away, and we did that at UCLA, start right away with a student engagement effort, it's been my observation on our campus that they get more traction once you actually tie the student's experience to the success of the goals. So I hope to share some information about that later. The next thing is that you have to have sufficient resources and organizational support that all aligns to helping you be successful. And ideally, this is by leveraging existing resources rather than just creating a whole nother silo. The next one we have is thoughtful governance that allows for ownership of allowing many people to have ownership, not just the leader, and a lot of checks and balances. Ideally, everyone feels it's their moonshot and they're committed to the success. And this is actually harder to achieve than it sounds. The next one is the importance of communication, and this can't be emphasized enough. It has to be communication within the teams, which are really large, on campus with up above and below wherever your office sits, with external stakeholders. And these are really long-term goals in the case of the ones we've been talking about. And so you tend to get caught up in the projects and you may forget to actually communicate. And then people assume nothing's happening if they haven't heard anything. So I'm super impressed with what University of New Mexico has been doing on the communication front. Everything they're doing is transparent, and you can actually sign up for their newsletter and hear all about their stuff as it's happening, like even live feeds of them in action. And the final one is that because these are long-term goals, we really need to have milestones so that we can show progress and be creative in what you're identifying as milestones. For example, every grand challenge, which actually I remembered right before you walked in here, you should have a work plan, a plan of how you're actually going to approach this. And then while you're approaching, you should have these milestones that you can report on. So that's time for questions.
So here are a few that have come up so far. Let's start by thinking about maybe lessons that can be learned from other grand challenges that didn't work so well. I would think Kumar and I were talking about this a little bit at lunch, kind of about coming from the government sector, what happens on that side when you try to pitch an idea. And also just thinking about it, maybe Michelle, from your side, since you've been doing grand challenges for a few years longer than UT, that riskiness, because this is something we all think about when we launch a grand challenge, is, you know, that's what makes it a grand challenge. It might very well fall flat on its face.
Yeah, so I think the big question, or I think on goal setting exercises, is politicians and policymakers love goals. There's a ready demand in any White House, in any administration, for goal setting exercises. And the reason is that in any policy topic, if you talk to the experts and you don't know enough about that discipline, it can sound like they're saying, we need more money. And if we had more money and more resources, we could make progress. And what does the politician or the policymaker who's kind of operating through lots of, they'll say, well, what will that get us? And the common challenge the research community says is, well, research is open-ended. It can go in a lot of directions. We don't know what will get us. A lot of what we invest in on R&D has unlikely consequences. And carrying those two tensions, which is policymakers say, well, what am I going to get by investing in this area, while also being able to actually engage in some specific goal setting, is a really delicate task. So I'll give an example of something we worked on, which was the grand challenge focused on the brain. And so the big challenge was, you know, on one level, the administration had been spending a lot of money on neuroscience, and this is an area of ongoing investment by the NIH. We went through a process of actually setting a moonshot for, you know, are there big advances that are happening in neuroscience and neurotechnology that could create new advancements in understanding and tackling neurodegenerative diseases, in understanding new model organisms that exist at the cluster of cells, not just at the individual brain cell. That idea, when it was first floated to the science community, I think got a range of different responses, because there's a big concern in the science community about ideas around big science. lots of these projects end up failing. And then there were big concerns about, what exactly will the White House or the administration engaging in a big push on neuroscience actually net us? I think now looking at it 5 years later, one of the big reasons why people consider that Grand Challenge effort to have been quite useful is that it did, I think, basically 3 or 4 things. I think one thing that it did was it actually improved the ability for NIH and a lot of the researchers who work in neuroscience to actually have a language for seeking out other partners. So there was lots of interesting work happening on neuroimagery, on the technical and technology side, and they could actually reach out to those communities and say, here are the biggest challenge goals that we've set out. There's work that's happening on the technology that you could help us on. So it actually led to unlikely partnerships. The second thing was they found that they could actually get programs going on their campuses that pull together lots of different academic departments. And third, it actually brought together folks within NIH itself. And so NIH built a 10-year roadmap on neuroscience that came out of that mapping activity. I think when these things don't work, it's when the policymakers and the politicians are more excited about the idea than the research community actually thinks that there's potential. So I think actually bridging those things is really important. So if people get really excited that we should make a big push on cancer, but there's nothing in the research community that says a big push right now could really pay off, then I think there's a lot more potential for diminished expectations. And so I think part of what I think is so exciting about a panel like this is universities can actually play a really important bridging role by setting Grand Challenge goals and then reaching out to policymakers and saying, this is something worth investing in. Here are ways that policy and resources can follow the important work that you're doing.
Great, thank you. So another one that came in that's been upvoted is, are any of your challenge programs across majors? If so, how did you get buy-in across departments and colleges? Which is a great question. As many know in the audience, I'm sure, that can be a major challenge, especially when you're thinking about universities as large as UCLA or as the University of Texas. I'll answer in UT's case, and then Michelle, you might want to talk for UCLA's case. So at UT's case, our Grand Challenge programs, the conceptualization of doing a Grand Challenge program was brought to us, the Vice President for Research, by our President, Greg Fenves, which was essentially him coming to us and saying, hey, let's do a Grand Challenges thing. You guys decide what to do from there, but let's do a Grand Challenges thing. We had worked at the university, my boss, the VP for Research, and I had been at UT for quite some time, and so we knew our institutional culture very well. And we knew that if we tried to do an initiative top-down, it would definitely fall flat. To have a Grand Challenge be successful, it has to be purpose-driven from the researchers, from the faculty, from the students who are doing that research. They need to have a reason that they want to do this on top of all of their other teaching commitments, their other research commitments, what's going on in their own research programs already. Why would they want to spend additional time getting together to try to work across the disciplines? And so for us, it was important that the ideas came from the researchers. So to arrive at our Grand Challenges, rather than saying, well, let's do something around sustainability, what could that be? And let's do something around biobehavioral health, what could that be? We put an open call out to the campus for all ideas, any big cross-disciplinary ideas that any principal investigators, whether they're faculty or whether they're staff researchers, might have that they would want to work on. And from that, we got 125 different ideas with 830 unique authors on those ideas across the campus. There was an overwhelming response, and we organized those into themes that we saw emerging, and then we charged all of those authors with getting together and trying to synthesize one research goal that they could all converge upon. So the rules were they couldn't just pick one of the papers and say, this is the Grand Challenge, nor could they take all of the papers and put them into what we call a quilt, which is everybody brings their square, and then we take a collection of loosely affiliated projects and say, all right, this is a Grand Challenge. They had to synthesize a goal that they all wanted to work toward. That process took close to a year, and it takes that much time for folks who don't know each other to get together, to trust each other that, okay, the research that you want to pursue is going to help. It isn't just advancing your own research agenda, but it's going to work toward solving some major societal challenge. And in that process, tough decisions were made about what was in scope and what wasn't, and some researchers peeled off into other things. And that's a natural process of it. But in the end, we have 2 themes and one under wraps that's coming soon. Just in 3 words, it's an ethical artificial intelligence theme. So all 3 of those were built from the ground up, from the bottom up, which means all the faculty that are involved are totally committed in there because they're purpose driven. Then the tricky part from there was then, us reaching the mid-level, going to the deans, and explaining to them that, don't think of this as because it's cross-disciplinary, it's not my college's thing, it's either some other college's thing or it's a VP for research thing because it's their thing. But what we do is we sit down with the deans and show them, here's a list of the faculty in your college who are participating in this grand challenge, and this is what they're doing. Doing that kind of one-on-one connection is what's enabled us to get the buy-in from the dean, so they can see or take ownership that yes, this is something that's being prioritized in my college, that there's interest in my college. It also helps that at the highest level, the president's office and central communications places us very prominently. We get placement on the UT homepage. A couple weeks ago, there was the Orange and Maroon Legislative Day, down at the State Ledge, where UT and Texas A&M come and showcase things they're doing, and the President's Communications Office picked our Grand Challenges program to represent the university there of all the research. So that kind of placement helps us at the top level too, that visibility.
At UCLA, our initiative also started from the research office, and it really was a research play, not with students added in to enrich the Grand Challenge. But it wasn't driven by majors or by certain departments. It was, we were trying to achieve a number of different goals, among those building bigger teams, having people be able to have a bigger impact because they were on bigger teams, really being able to demonstrate the value that our university and really public universities across the country have on their communities. It was a communications challenge. We did want to have student immersion experiences because back then in 2012 when we started, we did not have so many of these experiences. We were still much more didactic in how we were teaching our students, and so we saw this as a way to push, and we also saw it as a way for faculty development to occur. So those were our drivers, and as the years went on, other offices have surfaced who have taken on, thank goodness, these other aspects, because truly our office didn't have any business being in the education space. That wasn't our core competency. So.
There's another question here that's been upvoted. What role do you see for the arts in meeting grand challenges? That's a good one too. We have our arts and humanities fellows are very much involved in our grand challenges, and that's something I'm actually particularly proud of, because we were cautious at the beginning when we put that initial call out to make the rounds at the respective colleges and let them know that this isn't just going to be about who can come up with a $100 million idea that's going to be the next greatest tech. That we really want this to be bringing together all the different disciplines across the academy to look at societal challenges. And so I'll give a couple concrete examples. In our Planet Texas 2050 Sustainability Grand Challenge, we have a group of humanists. There's an effort that we call Texas Water Stories. And what these folks are doing, so these are historians, these are some of our archaeologists, a couple of different things. One is we have humanists that are up in the Panhandle in West Texas talking with farmers up there about the impacts of climate change that they're observing. They don't always specifically like that terminology, climate change, but when we talk with them about, are you seeing the season shifting? Winter is starting later, spring is starting later. How have you been adapting? How's it changing the way you're farming? So we're getting those narratives, and then we can overlay or map on top of that all this water data that we're integrating from the Texas Water Development Board, from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So we can actually look at maps of the water in the soil and how that's changed from the 1940s to now. We can look at, the average temperature and how that's changed from the 1940s to now, or whenever these folks, parents or grandparents, started farming on that land that they're on, as they're talking to us about the changes that they've witnessed in their lifetime. And so we're able to put this human dimension onto it. We have classicists that do archaeological digs all over the world, the idea being that we're not the first society to face, increasing demand on resources that comes with lots of people moving to the area. And so there are things to be learned there too about how other societies might have handled this. And the other thing that we talk about on a practical level is, Hurricane Harvey hit a couple of years ago in Texas, and we obviously in Austin didn't have nearly the impact or effect that we had in Houston, yet we still had this gas shortage in Austin. Even though, a data of maps, some data of the gas in Texas would have told you, oh, there's enough gasoline in Austin, they'll be fine, there won't be a gas shortage. People's perception was there's gonna be a gas shortage because, those refineries were hit in Houston. And so just that data alone doesn't always tell you the whole story of how people are going to react and what people are going to do.
The craziest story of how arts can approach a grand challenge is, so one of the USAID grand challenges was on Ebola. When Ebola was raging, one of the design workshops that came out of it was actually focused on the fact that one of the big concerns about public health officials being on site was just contamination. So it takes you multiple hours to put on the suit, take it off, it takes 2 people, that's a risk of exposure. So one of the big things that they wanted to work on was, could you actually have a suit that you could take on and take off in under 30 minutes, and you could do it by yourself? And so there was this, USAID hosted this meeting where they invited lots of folks from fashion and the designer industry to actually model the suit. So you had a bunch of folks who were actually working on the Ebola crisis, a bunch of folks who were kind of makers and designers designing a new suit. And a couple of those designs from that one-day session have now gone into production. So that's an example where, what you actually need to tackle it requires a real set of cross-mix of skills, and often you don't know where the solutions will take you.
I also think that the arts can play a really important role in communicating about our grand challenges and our moonshot initiatives. I know UCLA has had some wonderful videos that have come out with famous musicians, frankly, that are directly linked to their grand challenges. Again, really thinking about how we can convey the value of the work being done on our campuses to the public in a way that's appealing and catchy and resonates with them.
Great. So, move to the next part of the talk, which is really the how part. So now that we've defined a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about grand challenges in this context, pass me the clicker. We're going to talk a little bit more about the how portion. So what I want to do here is revisit those 8 attributes of successful grand challenge programs that Michelle outlined for us a few minutes ago. When she first put that list together, I looked at it and I said, well, I should just copy paste this slide because all of those are challenges too. So the next couple slides are going to revisit those and with each identify some kind of major barriers or challenges that we've observed and in our community of practice of grand challenges across universities, common roadblocks we run into in trying to achieve those attributes. And then importantly, we're going to offer a couple of strategies that we found are useful to overcome those barriers. So if you look at the column on the left here, you will recognize these attributes that Michelle was just speaking about. And then in the middle, you'll see what some of these challenges, what we think the common challenges are, and then the success strategies. So with the Goldilocks fit, as we were talking when we answered our first question there, the trick is convergence and trying to get people to agree upon a priority. We talked about the importance of the research being purpose-driven, that you want to make sure that the faculty, the researchers, the students that are engaged, they're there because they want to solve this complex problem. They want to see a dent made in that problem in their lifetime. I've put not opportunity-driven in parentheses here, and what I mean by that is opportunity-driven would be trying to rally a team together in response to some external call. So for example, oh, well, there's a funding opportunity out there for $50 million for a big idea. Let's try to find some faculty that could lead this. And trying to respond to initiatives that way is, in my experience, is rarely successful, because you're bringing people together around this promise for outside money, and you can't be sure that everybody's intentions or everybody's motivations are the same, and so then there's often a struggle in the team dynamic in terms of what people are trying to do, and people are trying to push their agenda to the front. With the Grand Challenge program, in contrast, because as Michelle said, often these really start on goodwill and the promise that eventually we'll get to a place where it's attractive outside. People are really involved because they want to be there. For leadership commitment, we talked already about the visibility of the commitment being important. That's very important that both the university campus, but also the public sees the university, the top level investment in the Grand Challenge program. And so we talked about priority placement. I talked about our Grand Challenges being placed on websites, the Grand Challenges being selected to represent UT research in various different venues. But also, it's important to maintain a commitment through leadership transitions. So Grand Challenge programs, the UT programs are meant to last a period of 8 to 10 years. UCLA, I think, is somewhat longer. But what that tells you is, the typical tenure for a university president or provost or even a dean is maybe 7 years or so. So you're going to see a leadership change, and sometimes many. How many did you say you've seen?
We've seen, at my last count, we had 13 transitions from the launch of the first Grand Challenge to now. 13 deans and higher.
So
and that was, and something, why it's on the tips list is because we didn't manage that as well as we could have.
But it does provide an opportunity, I think, to make course corrections.
For sure. It's actually an opportunity to start again in building, letting that person, the new people who come in, letting them actually put their stamp on it in some way so that it feels like it's theirs as well. And I'm seeing that even with my newest boss, the third, since I started the program, that he's doing reviews. And by doing these external reviews, he's able to change, course correct on both of the Grand Challenges to address things. He gets the stamp to say, yes, these are on the right track with these tweaks. And so he can feel confident taking those on as his own.
Great. So for partnership with relevant stakeholders, this is both inside and outside the university. Inside the university, this includes the researchers themselves, leadership at multiple levels, the dean level, the vice president level, the executive or president, provost level, but also includes external stakeholders, which are going to vary based on the Grand Challenge and what audience it targets. So for us, for Planet Texas 2050, our external stakeholders include Texas state agencies who oversee environmental resources, as I talked about. For our other Grand Challenge, for Whole Communities, Whole Health, those external stakeholders include Central Texas communities, which are both community organizations, such as Central Health, but also individuals and families, because we're ultimately looking to enroll a cohort of 300 families in Central Texas for our study. So we have to build their trust. We have to make sure that our priorities align with what they want to know. In the case of the state agencies for Planet Texas 2050, we could build a beautiful model that incorporates water, land, weather data, but if the agencies have if we make something that they can't use or they can't integrate into the scenario planning that they're charged by the state with doing, then it's not going to get any use outside of the university. So it's important to bring these people in early at the beginning, to co-design your goals with input from these external stakeholders to find out what it is the university would need to build or need to create for those external entities to be able to use it, for it to be useful to them. And also to include these folks to some degree on the governance of the theme and in review and deciding what are priorities. For meaningfully engaging students, I think particularly at the beginning of a Grand Challenge when it's first launching, there are many, many competing priorities. Trying to decide and articulate what exactly the goal is, whose research is in scope and whose research is not in scope, What are we able to do based on the expertise that's already on the campus or based on the geographic location or other factors of where the university is situated, that it can be difficult to make sure that students are really integrated in a meaningful way, rather than a sort of default of, well, maybe we could create a course in this topic, where it's much stronger if you can come up with specific ways to plug in the students for experiential learning. So we find that having dedicated funding that is protected for student research, that is not separate from the pot that is used for internal funding for the faculty-led research, and trying to integrate strong student experiential learning programs that may already exist on the campus with the grand challenges, although that takes more time than just creating a course and having the faculty lecture, and that is well worth it. For some of these others, sufficient resources and supportive operations, obviously securing and sustaining funding is always going to be a challenge. Dedicated internal funding sure is useful, we could have guessed that, but I think even more important is dedicated staff for fundraising externally. On our campus, this is a combination both of the Vice President for Research having dedicated staff for major proposal development, for some of the major federal agency grants and other opportunities that come up that are aligned with these grand challenges. But then we also have dedicated staffing in the University Development Office, who are critical for placing the grand challenge teams in front of prospective donors and placing the grand challenge teams in front of private foundations, our alumni, and getting the messaging out across all of those different channels as well. For thoughtful governance, I think it's very important to design mechanisms that allow every individual researcher who's touching the grand challenge to feel some ownership of the Grand Challenge project. Again, this goes back to the origin effect and setting it up correctly from the start so that the researchers have a say in what's happening, so that they don't feel that it's the administration's project and they're just vying for some funding therein, but it's actually a research challenge that they want to solve. Allowing for ownership at other levels can involve creating advisory councils, perhaps an advisory council of deans that weighs in on the grand challenge, or other advisory councils within the university that are part of the periodic reviews we talked about previously. For internal and external communications, it can be very challenging to talk about such massive problems and can we really make a dent and try to solve this. It can be challenging to talk about long time horizons. So as Michelle mentioned, reducing the burden of depression by half and trying to eliminate that burden in this century. Well, this century, we won't be here none of us will be here at the end of this century. So that can be a challenge to think about, well, how do we talk about this? We found that finding news opportunities is important. A lot of times we have a tendency to say, well, let's hold back until we've had a big research breakthrough and we've published that paper, and then we can report on that. And that way our peer institutions will see what we're doing and appreciate the validity of what it is we're trying to do. But instead, it's important to create the news when even small milestones are reached, when some progress is made. Because what we found is no news in this case is not good news. No news seems to suggest to people that progress is not being made when in fact it is.
And that actually goes to, I'm kind of cheating and looking at the slide while you're talking. Someone did ask for more detail on work plans and milestones.
Yeah.
So if I could just chime in on that.
Please do.
So work plans could be a whole session on its own. But it seems that most Grand Challenge programs go through this process where they may identify what the big goal is, and that is what we did in our case. And then there is some process they go through to actually identify how they're going to do it. And in the case of our 2 Grand Challenges, we had two completely different approaches. In one, it was a gathering of people together, and they started brainstorming again over almost a year-long period to create our work plan, which is online, for the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge. For the other one, they actually flipped and they had some money to give away. So they used the funding opportunity as a way to generate the ideas. And then from the ideas, they actually brought those researchers together. So it's a little bit like what UT Austin did with theirs, but it was a finite group on particular topics. So all the basic scientists who had submitted proposals were brought together in a room and actually debated amongst their projects and reformulated, and then that became the work plan. They decided that these are the 7 projects we need to get done in the next 5 years that will make a difference. And so their work plan was created that way, one arm for the discovery neuroscience, a second arm for the clinical research. And what we haven't done yet, but we're working on, is our third piece for the Depression Grand Challenge, which ties into another question about arts, which is how do we break the stigma associated with depression? Because it doesn't matter if we solve the science, we still have a stigma problem where people aren't going to get help. And so for that, the scientists are not the experts in this arena, and we are turning to what we call North Campus, which are our arts, humanities, and social scientists, to bring them together to help us take a look at what is it that's happening. Can we understand what is the basis of the stigma, probably different by different population group, and then develop strategies to address those. And as far as milestones, switching away from the work plan, what we've realized is you have to be a little more, you have to look at things beyond the actual deliverables. There's lots of steps that occur, and what I really push the teams to do, and have never, but I think it's not so realistic to map out exactly like this is step A, this is step B, this is step C, but you can look at various things to see, are we making progress in terms of funding? Are we making progress in terms of engaging or training students? Are we having an impact on early career faculty members? These are things that we can trace pretty quickly, in addition to the actual pilot projects that are also delivering results. So just for a few.
One crazy example of milestones, I just think, is so we just had Dragon dock at the International Space Station. And one interesting sort of historical fact about NASA and its use of commercial crew is, from a policy standpoint, we face this really interesting challenge, which is how do you invite new players to engage in space when part of what we're also trying to solve for is safety, right? So usually, if you're anybody who operates in space, you have to show that you have a track record on the particular launch capability and a safety record. Well, what's the other side of having a safety record? It means that if you've never done it before, you don't have a safety record that you can submit. So it actually acts as a barrier to entry. So one question that we sort of faced was, if you're going to actually engage in actually having American vehicles take American astronauts back into space, you could say, hey, we should go with folks who have already done it before. Or we should say, oh, we should just set a big goal and just see who can do it. Well, there's a huge amount of risk if NASA just said, well, we'll just see who can do the best job. And so NASA actually came up with 20 plus performance goals with milestone-based payments. And what the Dragon vehicle that just docked this past weekend was like step 20 of a 24-step path that NASA outlined a decade ago, of saying, here are the steps that need to happen for a new player to be able to have the awesome responsibility of taking American astronauts all the way to the International Space Station and back. And so slowly they're making their path. So milestones can be a very powerful way that you can actually set really long-term goals and say, well, to actually meet those goals, we have to take this iterative step-by-step process. And it took NASA a ton of effort to create those goals, but also gave them confidence that if everything was happening on these ways, new players could actually take on this responsibility.
Great. Let's look at some of these other ones that are here. We have a few more minutes. One is, how are you patenting and licensing your innovations to ensure access and affordability for taxpayers who are funding the research? And I would say that on UT's side, both of our grand challenges are at the newness stage enough that we haven't yet had something come out that's patentable. When we get there, we will be working through our Office of Tech Commercialization, as we do for many of UT's innovations, because just like taxpayer-funded research, actually, we do have a lot of research at UT that it ends up being supported through licensing revenues that come from some of those innovations that come out of the university. Michelle, have you had any of your outputs
that are directly related? The faculty who are involved with the Grand Challenges have had things come out. Can I trace that it was exactly our project that got them there? I don't think so yet. But we've seeded a few. We've seeded, I think, something like 47 projects for Sustainable LA. They're all online under the research tab under Sustainable LA if you want to take a look at them. And from those, I expect that a few will actually have something that is protectable.
Do you maybe want to talk about the Sustainable LA report card? That's actually a really interesting kind of transparent, transparent metrics document.
But I want to make sure we get to the next slides that they have as well. So the report card is something that actually predated the launch of the Grand Challenge, but was repackaged for the Grand Challenge. And what it is it's measuring a number of factors about the county of Los Angeles. And what, in terms of like air quality, energy, water use, and there's sub-points to each of them. And what was most interesting about starting on this by making it the Grand Challenge framework as the first iteration after we had launched was the fact that there was no data for a lot of these elements. And so what became early projects for the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge was actually just baseline setting. And anyone who does take on a Grand Challenge, this could be the case where you don't actually know where you're at when you're starting, but you have to take that baseline measure in order to show that you're making progress. And so those report cards are coming out about once a year, and they're now no longer all subjects at a time. It's a massive undertaking, and so there's, and I'm actually not as involved with the details with them now as I was when we launched, but I think the next one is going to be ecosystem health.
All right. So our final point, our final section is to talk about some of the cross-sector participation in these university-led moonshots. And so for that, Sarah and Kumar are going to weigh in.
Absolutely. So I think before we get to cross-sector participation a little bit, I'd like to talk about why this sort of research is so appealing to us at APLU. Again, we are a higher education organization. We have 241 member institutions. And for us, this is thinking about research differently, really thinking about conveying the value of research to the public and encouraging our institutions, whether they are very large institutions like UCLA and the University of Texas at Austin, or whether they're a smaller, less research intensive, maybe more regional institution, that this sort of research can really touch the community and lift all boats and have a measurable impact on the public while both advancing discovery and resulting in new applications of research. And so the external partnerships are such an important part of Grand Challenge and Moonshot research. Again, we have very different stakeholders, all with their unique key roles that they play, including government, including industry, including philanthropy, and I know Kumar will touch upon that a little more with his experiences. And again, really, we see that the causes very much resonate. I know there was a question that came in about how are these Grand Challenges ultimately picked. One I know that the four of us like to highlight is Indiana University and their Addictions Grand Challenge. That came about because the governor of Indiana approached IU and said, hey, we have a problem here. Is this somewhere where the university could do something? And so again, that is a partnership right off the bat, right there. And really, again, why some of these themes resonate with the public and also have the potential to have an outsized impact. Again, thinking about interdisciplinary research, multidisciplinary research, research that goes beyond the scope of what a single PI in a single lab is capable of accomplishing. And again, that is fundamental to tackling a whole problem, a wicked problem, in a very holistic, interdisciplinary, and coordinated manner.
Yeah, I mean, the big part that I think I find fascinating about this body of work, both as from my policy background and now sort of wearing the philanthropy hat, it's just that I think if you take a step back, we as a society are struggling with a number of interrelated questions. One big question that always comes up whenever I talk to higher ed is we feel like we're under attack, right? We feel like people are asking about our value. And so university leaders will say, I have to show how we're connecting with the communities around where we are. I think that's one big question. Then there's a big question about what is universities as a physical space? What are students getting when they're on campus that is different than what they could get if they were just watching a video, right? So that's a related question. And the third question is, well, what is the role that, even as we sort of talk about interdisciplinarity and different research departments working together and saying computation and other things are taking over, what does this kind of look like in practice? And so one thing that I find sort of exciting about this is, yes, the university leaders matter, but the doers that are kind of on the stage who've actually over a decade built up these programs, I think provide a really good case example for how you can actually go about this process of building a really deep partnership with your local community, which I think Texas represents. So now Texas state agencies are doing powerful work with the university that is different than just the two telling each other what they're doing. Or, I hear about the UCLA work from folks in LA County. And so I think these are deeper, more meaningful partnerships. And I also think that in a world in which we're talking about how do we get more of our young people excited about STEM education, starting and completing, all the research shows that it's about connecting it to real world problems. And, I think using a grand challenge, one tagline we sort of use is how do we make sure that you don't just major in a discipline, but that you minor in a problem? That you're leaving your academic experience obsessed with something that you want to actually do in the world. And I think these kind of cross-campus moonshot efforts can actually tie things together. So the big sort of, advice I would give on the philanthropy side is to actually, try to harness the energy that intersects the conversations around the role of the university, the role of equity, the role of science to actually solve real problems. And this is, I think, a powerful framework to do it. And I think for policymakers, I would say that it's a powerful, again and again, we found that this was a really powerful organizing tool. So in 2010, when the Department of Energy picked, solar as cheap as coal, what was interesting was one, they were really scared of picking that as a goal because they were like, what if we're wrong? But what was actually really interesting was they, in that process, found a number of key drivers for driving down solar costs that they had not predicted. So for example, if you had asked them in 2010, what are the biggest areas for improvement, they would have said, oh, it's driving down the cost of the actual solar panels. What they would say a year or two into it is all the soft costs associated with solar installation are the biggest drivers. So how do you make them at scale really cheaply, and how do you install them? So the Department of Energy effort actually became an effort to work with mid and small sized cities on solar installation, then it became into a pure R&D initiative. And I think when you set big goals and then work backwards, you can find unlikely contributors to the problem. So I think this is an important framework that more folks can use to solve more challenges. And I was the person who worked on 100,000 STEM teachers over 10 years, and I found it certainly motivating in my own work as a way to organize my time.
Actually, I'd like to go back to one more point that you made, Kumar, with respect to students. I love the line, we need students to major in a discipline but minor in a problem. I think that's actually Tom Khalil's line. I always love when he says that. But two other things with respect to students that I've also seen up on our questions. I do believe the NAE Grand Challenge Scholars Program, that is a fantastic program. And I know I was on their website a few weeks ago, and I do think that there is an uptick of students both interested in grand challenges and in this model of solving problems and thinking differently, more holistically, but also students who they participate in a program like the NAE Grand Challenge Scholars, and then take that mindset with them, whether they end up in a PhD program, in industry, or elsewhere. I remember seeing on the website recently these fantastic case studies of students who had been involved in that program and had gone on to really wonderful next steps. I also would like to give a shout out to Georgia Tech and their Grand Challenges Living Learning Community. Again, another sort of smaller residential program, but again, really fostering this mindset of thinking about problems and thinking about how you can engage the community and other key stakeholders and go out and solve them.
Yeah, no, I think that the work that's happening on the student side is really powerful. I don't know if you found this on your campuses as a way to motivate both more students, but also a broader and representative sample of students.
Right, sure. Well, we engage students for the Depression Grand Challenge. They're actually, we're training a cohort of students every year to be resilience peers. And so they actually become part of our treatment workforce. For students who are experiencing depression, our chancellor announced, a year and a half ago that we would screen all students for depression and anxiety, and those who are presenting as needing services would be provided those services for free through the Depression Grand Challenge. And the way we are able to do that is through newer technologies and this resilience peer workforce where the students have been trained and actually serve as champions, resources for their peers under supervision of licensed therapists. And in addition to those experiences, because we have students with higher needs, the grad students are getting exposure and actual clinical hours, taking care of those students who are more of moderate risk, and then those who are actually suicidal, which unfortunately there are some who are, those are being put into, they're basically a swarm where we reach out to them and get them into services right away. Great. So a powerful a powerful, unanticipated benefit of having the Grand Challenge was actually being able to do something for our own student body.
So I want to just put up some of our additional resources before I return to some of these questions, because a couple of them I think you'll find some good information that's deeper than what we can get into in the remaining 5 minutes in this report on university-led grand challenges, which UCLA put together after Michelle's brought a copy with her. Light reading. After convening a workshop in the fall of 2017 that involved a couple dozen universities, including both of ours, that have engaged in different Grand Challenge programs. So I would highly recommend checking this out. It goes through each of these attributes that we've listed and strategies for them, plus some more that we didn't have time to get to today. But there were a couple questions here. For example, can the arts be primary partners in Grand Challenges? Absolutely. I think we absolutely see this in Planet Texas 2050, in addition to the Texas Water Stories project, which is narrative-led. We also have a project, and they're led by an artist, Marie Lorenz, who has actually built a boat and has been taking this down the Colorado River and through Austin, picking up people and taking them in the boat. And while she takes photographs of what she calls the gray belt, which is the sewer stormwater kind of infrastructure that just kind of runs in a hum through the city, and talks with people as she picks them up about, do you ever think about this water, this kind of water, and that this is something that the city runs on, and how we treat this and how we conserve this. She also has a drone that flies overhead, so it's really nice to contextualize the photos she's taking at the ground, at the street level, with where does this sit in the context of a map. So that is definitely possible. And what I wanted to point out with the Grand Challenges report, if you just want to toggle back to the resource slide and stay there, we're good, is that it includes a list of grand challenges, not just for our 2 universities, but many, many others. So there was another question here that asked, do you have any experience with grand challenges that are based on social problems rather than these problems that sound more scientific in nature? For example, racial injustice in schools. And I would say that the Indiana Addictions Challenge is a great example of one that has a huge social component. Our forthcoming Ethical AI Challenge actually has a huge social component. It was born by, but from several, from a few dozen faculty asking questions about this intersection of technology and humans, and how are we going to live the good life in this tech-enabled world. And when we first brought those faculty together to start trying to synthesize an idea, a couple computer scientists in the room, had put in a paper where they said, well, this AI is going to be very great, but we should probably be asking questions about the ethics of it and what would make for good AI. And some of the humanists said, all right, well, some of us have been asking what is good for our entire career. So you might want to check in with us about that, and that's really helped to shape the direction and help that theme, get a better handle on not just the technological investigations, but the conceptual investigations about what this
Kantian AI.
Yeah.
I like it.
yeah, about what this future is going to mean. And there was another question that I thought, do we have data that provides an overall picture of successful and not so successful moonshots?
Well, I think we're too new for the current ones. There are successful ones, I think, that go back. From what I remember reading, this is years ago already, so I could have it wrong, but I think something about preservation, like food preservation, was a grand challenge at the time. Like that came from that.
Of the Obama administration ones, there's one that completed, which was the Solar's. That one completed at the 7-year mark. So they got to say we met the goal at 7 years instead of 10. We set one that wasn't a grand challenge goal, but was, kind of a multi-organization goal, which was 100,000 STEM teachers over 10 years, and that one's on track. The BRAIN initiative didn't set a challenge goal that was on, these sort of disease outcomes, because we didn't want to set disease outcomes as the goal. But that one has made substantial progress compared to the NIH 12-year roadmap. I'm trying to think of which other. There's been a number of DARPA grand challenges, such as on autonomy in cars, that have far exceeded the original goalposts. So it's not something that is a magic elixir. So there's certainly ones that don't make progress, but a number of the more prominent ones have made real progress against the goal.
And I want to quickly follow up, Kumar, on that point. I have a list that I keep of different Grand Challenge programs that either have existed or are currently in existence. And when I have a minute, I do want to go back. I would love to learn why some that we haven't seen updates. Again, no news. You do need to be sharing news. Why they failed or what went wrong. And that's really what we're striving to move the needle with our APLU Public Impact Focused Research Report, which you'll see up on the screen. And we really want to provide a document that will be a resource for our university presidents, for our university senior research officers, vice presidents, vice chancellors for research, to really showcase the benefit of why we would do this, to provide solutions or different things that you should think about with respect to common barriers and challenges, and really have this out there, both to foster more of this sort of research and really to encourage our colleges and universities to engage.
And for me, I think it's just that the old adage kind of holds true, right? If you shoot for the moon, even if you miss, you'll land among the stars. So even if you set an audacious goal and you don't quite get there, the chances that you've made a dent in something or made some progress are greater.
And that's actually a good point to end on, because no one's going to come get us or yell at us if we make it 90% of the way there, because we weren't going to get there without setting the goal so high.
Right. Thank you so much for your time this evening.